my talk. Here we go. How he said he living life as a gringo. Where you question where you fit in every time you mingle. They say you do this with not enough that. My rapping is really bad. This life as a gringo.
Yes, hello and welcome to another episode of Life as a Gringo. I am Dramos, of course. And man, we are in the midst of Latin Heritage Month. And I've been trying to, I want to say on brand with that, with, Latin heritage centric things, at least for the time being. I've got a couple of things I want to speak on and kind of get into in upcoming episodes. But I thought it'd be interesting for today's show in the spirit of Latin Heritage Month and just sort of paying homage to the roots of this show as a whole, right? When I made this podcast and conceptualized it, initially it was a book idea, and then I, kind of crafted it into a podcast when the opportunity came about. But, it's the idea of embracing your otherness and a life spent feeling like an outsider, even within your own community or within your own family. And I feel like as the show's evolved, we've gotten a lot more into spiritual growth and growth in general, personal growth, I should say, and wellness, and obviously talking about current events that affect our community and making sure that this is a show that speaks to our community in various ways. But I thought it'd be fun, since we are in the midst of Latin Heritage Month, and there's been so many people discovering this podcast, as it continues on. Here we are, coming towards the end of our second season here, and in just I think it's like a month or so. But I wanted to revisit the basis for the show, right, and talk about this idea of being Latin enough, right? For some of you, this may have never necessarily been something that you struggle with. I know some of you have always identified with your culture and more so don't attach to that aspect of this show, but attach to it just as a Latin person, continuing their connection with their culture and their community. And, I think even amidst this conversation, for those of you who that resonates with, this might open your eyes to some of the things that other members of the community go through. And I think as a larger conversation, this is really just a conversation around authenticity and finding the courage to walk in yours, right? I think that's what so many of us struggle with when it comes to our identity and how we relate to the world around us and our search for community that we're all on, no matter, where we sort of fall, no matter what our race, our background is, whatever it might be. We're all searching for somewhere that we can call home, that we belong to, right? And I think particularly for those of us who have sort of felt alienated by our otherness, particularly be it as a Latino here, or again, insert whatever sort of scenario works for you. But, for me, this was something that carried a lot of shame. It sort of made me become more of like a chameleon, where I would craft my voice depending on the room that I was in, right? And not necessarily have a real opinion or a real stance that was authentic to me, but more so just wanting to be liked by others, right? Because of this otherness, right? Of not feeling accepted by those who are supposed to kind of just embrace me with open arms as one of them. And obviously we're talking about the Latin community. We're talking about family, and I've talked about this a ton about, sort of my family back in Puerto Rico, making the distinction that I was American, I was a gringo to them, right? That I was lesser than, right? And even if it was in a joking manner, it still was this distinction that they felt it necessary to make, right? And I think a lot of that dynamic sort of created the people pleaser that existed in me for a very long time, and that I still struggle with till this day. And that's why I think it's so important to kind of revisit this conversation, especially as I've gotten to meet some of you who listen to this podcast, and I've gotten to connect with you, be it via our Just Be Social Club or on Instagram or whatever it might be, and sort of hearing you resonate with that story or empathizing with it or feeling connected to it in some sort of way. I think that it kind of makes me aware of the importance of the work we're doing here. And I think it's great to kind of revisit this idea of not feeling like you're enough, right? whatever it might be. Today we're talking about, not being quote unquote Latin enough, right? But again, insert it into whatever sort of thing that you're going through yourself or have gone through, right? So that's what we're talking about today, really revisiting the roots of this podcast. And I pulled in a blog post. I was going to say an article, but it's more of a blog post from a website called projectnye.com. And it's just a quick little kind of blog post talking about how certain celebrities have always talked about how they don't feel like they've been embraced by their community. We'll also kind of just talk about my own journey with this and certain things that I've learned along the way that I think have been helpful for me, for anybody that is still on that journey or, just maybe needs a refresher. Again, I think this is a larger conversation around authenticity at the end of the day. So I think this would be a great kind of refresher to get back into the core of this podcast, as we are, again, about a month or so away from the end of season 2. And I think it's only perfect to bring it in the midst of Latin Heritage Month. So with that said, let's first dive into this blog post that I pulled here. We'll do it in a segment we call For the People in the Back.
Say it louder for the people in the Say it louder for the people in the back.
All right, so the blog that I'm pulling from, it's projectnye.com. The specific article on here is, Am I Latina Enough? And in it, she starts off by saying, last week, a friend forwarded me an article about 7 Latinas in Hollywood that didn't feel, quote, Latina enough. The celebrities talked about feeling rejected, not accepted, or having image issues. Some felt they fell short of being Latina enough because they didn't speak Spanish, or they didn't cook certain foods, or they grew up in American schools where Latino culture isn't taught on a daily basis. So they acted more American than Latina. And I'm sure this is resonating for a lot of you. For me, even, I think it's as simple as when you're growing up in an American school. I know for me, when I was going to school in the suburbs in New Jersey, there wasn't a large Latin, cohort, if you will, in my school. And the small group that there was, I wasn't a part of. So, I started acting, I guess, more American than Latino. Now, in the article, she goes on to say, as I read the article, I was surprised and saddened to read about these famous and accomplished Latina celebrities who felt judged and alienated by a culture that they so deeply wanted to connect with, but the feeling wasn't mutual. The Latino culture was denying them that connection. And she's pulling some quotes from that article that she's referencing. This one from Eva Longoria saying, quote, "It's very difficult to live in our community if you don't speak Spanish. Everyone will judge you," she said. "A lot of Latinos don't speak Spanish perfectly and feel rejected in our community." And I think obviously there's like generalizations, right? So it's not all like jump to bite off Eva Longoria's head. But I think if I'm being honest, one of the things that still makes me self-conscious till this day is that I don't feel completely comfortable speaking Spanish. Now, it's gotten a lot better. I have sort of forced myself beyond the shame or embarrassment. And whenever I do go somewhere that is, be it a restaurant that is, Latino, or there are, or I'm just traveling to Puerto Rico or something like that, I make it a point to try and speak Spanish as much as humanly possible, to challenge myself in that way. But you do feel it when you mess up. You do feel the judgment, to a certain extent from certain people. There is this sort of feeling of being lesser than, or when they find out, oh, you're Puerto Rican, the Boricua, you're being like a taxi or something. And then like, there's like this test that goes on beyond that, right? This sort of unspoken test when they start speaking to you in Spanish about where your family's from and all these things. And you could feel it when you fuck up or don't answer properly, that it's like you have failed said test. So I agree definitely in that instance. Now, they also pull a quote from America Ferrero who says, "I love my culture and I'm very proud of my culture. I want to learn so much about where my family is from and my roots and to know Spanish. But when you've lived your entire life in American schools, you don't get that." Kind of reiterating what we were talking about before. And the last quote she pulled was from Rosario Dawson, where Rosario says, "I think being Latina is about having pride in your heritage. Although I am not a fluent Spanish speaker, I can't make every dish without a recipe. I am 100% Boricua, and I am proud of that." And I love that. I also love Rosario Dawson, if she somehow is listening to this podcast. Big fan, big fan. Now, moving on, it says in the blog, she writes, it got me thinking about the human condition and the very real idea that we all share that, quote, not good enough truth to some degree, regardless of our parentage or culture. As a Latina, I could personally identify with what these ladies were saying. I too have felt the pain, disappointment, and longing to connect with my Puerto Rican culture. As I sat personally connected to this article, it got me thinking, what good can come out of feeling bad or having a negative experience in common? As a filmmaker and content creator, I've had the distinct pleasure of interviewing people about the very same topic through Project Enya, which is, I guess, some ongoing project that she has going on. I do a little more research of that. But she says, the conversations are so personally moving and punctuated by tears, highs, and laughter that afterwards it feels like we have both gone through a journey somewhere together. In the past 18 months, I have sat across from 72 people asking them about their lives, their story, and their version of what these Latina celebrities have shared above. Hopefully, one day I'll be able to sit across from these celebrities and go on this journey with them of building community and connectedness among American Latinas and Latinos. Here's to wishing. And it's a pretty short article, so I'll read the rest of it. She says, why is it important to share these feelings and, in a way, quote, come clean about something that could be perceived in a negative way? Because odds are someone is feeling the same way. And believe it or not, it is possible to develop feelings of connection through rejection. And that's actually a bar right there. It is possible to develop feelings of connection through rejection. It is possible to develop feelings of connection through rejection. I love that right there. And I think that's this podcast in a nutshell, right? And I think that's been my experience, is that when I own up to the thing that I'm ashamed of, right? My lack of Latinness, quote unquote, that is when I developed or felt more a part of the very community that I felt like was shunning me, right? That's when I felt like I was seeing others and connecting with other people and a part of something larger than myself, right? It was when I had the audacity to be authentic in that way, right? And again, it's when I push past the shame that comes along with that otherness that I then actually found the community that I had been longing for, right? I think that's what this podcast is. I think a lot of people who I've spoken to who listen to this podcast on a regular basis, we have found connection in our common rejection, as wild as that kind of sounds. But I think that's beautifully put. The fact that we have felt like an outsider in some sort of way, and we can connect on that common ground, makes us feel less alone, and that the reality is that we are less alone because we're sharing in a common emotion, a common feeling, and a sort of vantage point that is very similar in the way that life has treated us and the way that we see the world as a result, right? So I love that connection through rejection idea. I think it's really beautiful. Now moving on to the blog, she says, how I wish I was when I was a little girl. I could have read that Jennifer Lopez was made to feel like she wasn't accepted by the Latino community because she didn't speak Spanish, or that Gina Rodriguez felt pain because no matter how hard she tried to proudly represent the Latino community, she fell short in the public's standards. And yeah, I mean, these are interesting sort of notes. I mean, I think Jennifer Lopez is an interesting one, right? Where the Latino community, I think till this day, there is some stigma around her. And the irony is that to the outside, like public eye outside of the Latino community, she is held up as Latin, right? And is viewed through the lens of a Latin woman, right? And has that experience, both good and bad. And I think that's sort of where some of the frustration, I think, lies for a lot of people is, you have a certain last name, or you give off a certain appearance, right? That is very obviously Latin or ethnic to the average person. And you then have this experience of otherness in the world while not having the feeling of being able to go back to a safe space like your community who understands you, right? So it's like nobody understands you and both sides are telling you that you don't belong here, right? And that's sort of been my experience. And I think the common experience of many people who listen to this podcast, and that's sort of what they're talking about here, and that I know for me, especially earlier on, and even when I was with like the Breakfast Club and I was like the resident Latin person there, and anytime anything Latin, didn't matter if it was like specific to Puerto Ricans, or it was anything, or any Spanish word came up, or how do you say this in Spanish? If I couldn't answer it to their sort of qualifications, or I couldn't answer it in general when it came to like, how do you say this in Spanish? It was like, oh, sorry, your Latinness is now revoked, right? You're not Latin, you're a fake Puerto Rican, this and that, right? It's this idea of always feeling you had to prove yourself, right? And I can even remember angry comments or DMs I would get from people who felt like I misrepresented them because I was speaking on behalf of all Latinos just by being the only one in the room, right? And I think, there's a difference between looking to educate and then just looking to shit on people and shun people. And I think too often we go with the latter, right? Instead of like using these things as like a teachable moment and saying like, listen, I respect you trying to put on for us, but I think this would have been the better answer, the better approach, the better thought process, or this is why you have a skewed view, or this is the real truth. It's like we're just quick to judge each other and write each other off. And that's part of the problem right there, is the lack of education process. And then when you talk about a younger generation who didn't grow up speaking Spanish as their first language, was born in the States, was born, primarily being served American culture, right? And American social norms. If you don't, create an environment that makes them feel comfortable in exploring their heritage, right? And their ancestry, you're going to begin to lose the Latin culture. We're going to begin to lose our culture as a whole, right? The history of it, the stories of it, the pride that we have, right? Because the newer generation is not going to feel like they can see themselves in it, right? And that's what scares me at the end of the day, is when we create this caste system. Of course, people are going to sort of shun their own heritage because they don't feel like they are a part of it, and that's when our history gets lost, right? That's when we begin the erasure of our beautiful culture and our beautiful history, and the next generation just sort of assimilates into whiteness, right? I think that to me is incredibly sad and scary when you think about the richness and the beauty of our history and our cultural contributions to this world. I would hate for that to be lost based upon, I don't know, this just like ignorant way of thinking of trying to create this system of supremacy, right? And we have to recognize that's also rooted in like the colonialism that has been instilled in us, right, by the Europeans that came over and made these designations of certain people being superior to others, right? And that doesn't serve us whatsoever. That just drives our community apart and contributes to the white supremacist sort of mentality of erasing ethnic cultures, right? And we've seen it in so many ways. Our culture, our history is not spoken about so much. We haven't had a seat at the table in a major way in the world of like entertainment and politics and things like that. And I think all of that contributes, or all of the sort of caste system and the making people feel lesser than contributes to us having smaller and smaller voices at the end of the day. Now, moving on to the blog, it says, reading these types of articles without a doubt would have impacted my life. They would have transformed the isolation I was feeling for the majority of my adolescence and early adulthood and given me hope. It all starts with the willingness to be vulnerable with someone and having an authentic conversation about that shared experience that many first-generation American-born Latinos experience but never talk about. What I found in my own work with Project Enya is that sharing these stories have the power to genuinely heal and connect people. In essence, we all walk in the same chancla. We just don't know it. But through Project Enya, we hope to change that. And just, I really fuck with the sort of ideology and message that she is putting out there. I almost wonder if we should have her on the show. I'm going to add that to the list, the running list of guests, which is a real thing. I'm not just saying them, and we're not taking note of it. We are working on getting some of the people we talk about. But yeah, I think I agree with that, right? I think if like this podcast existed when I was younger, and I got to look up to somebody and hear from somebody who not only celebrated and embraced their otherness, but then used it as the driving vehicle for their success and to make their dreams come true. I wouldn't be able to be anything but inspired, I think, right? And that's what this podcast I could have easily made a podcast where I really was just focusing on entertainment or this or that, right? And for me, the reason why this is my baby more than anything else that I do is because it represents something that I was longing for so long, and I'm honored to be able to hopefully fill a void and provide that for others who have felt alone, just like I did, right? And felt like they couldn't show up authentically and felt like they didn't have a voice or a place. Yeah, I mean that's what she's talking about here with the project she's working on and these celebrities, and why it's so important for those of us who feel comfortable to be vulnerable and to share our experiences, and why we all have a valid sort of experience to share, right? And we all are valid representatives of our community and have an important message to share as our experience within the community. Because that makes other people feel seen, right? Our braveness, our vulnerability allows somebody else to feel seen and to feel like they exist somewhere and not feel shame or a lack of self-worth, right? And I, in retrospect, looking back, kind of a lot of the healing work that I've done, I think not all, but a part of my lack of self-worth and this need for constant validation, I'm sure has to do with not feeling like I was welcomed as I was, at like I wasn't welcome with open arms as myself, right? Me authentically was not someone who was being embraced by his own community. I think that missing in my life contributed, along with a lot of other things, but it definitely was a big part of it, to my need for validation and my lack of self-worth, for sure. So I love that sort of message, and it's a reminder, and that's why I love revisiting kind of the core of this podcast at times, because it's a reminder of why I do what I do and why this is such an important topic of conversation. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not trying to pat myself on the back and make this into like something that it's not. But I know for me, the little moments where I felt like I saw myself in other people, those were huge for me to kind of keep pushing forward. And I hope that that's what this platform is for those of you who listen to it as well. Now, with that said, we're going to get into a little bit more of kind of my experience and some of the thoughts that I've been having in our Mi Gente segment. Mi Gente. So one of the things that I had happen recently, or just a conversation I should say that had happened recently, that kind of inspired me to revisit the basis of this podcast, was one of the members of our Just Be Social Club. He is, I'm not going to shout him out by name just in case this public, but he has a corporate job. And within that corporate job, they have, little sort of like social groups or whatever. And he's leading the Hispanic one for his company or his division, whatever it might be. And he was expressing this idea of not being sure if he was like the right person, or it's a lot of sort of imposter syndrome type of things, right? And he's sort of on this journey of reconnecting with his culture and his Latinness, right? And within that, now sort of being the spokesman for this Latin group, feeling like, oh shit, am I even worthy of holding this title, right? And my sort of response to that, my I guess advice to him when we were speaking about this was, at the end of the day, when you own it, right? When you own your perspective, your vantage point, your unique view of the world, the lens with which you see it, your unique experiences, and you own that as your truth, people have no choice but to sort of fall in line and respect it and get behind it. And obviously, there are going to at times be those who don't, and it is what it is. But for the most part, what I've sort of noticed is that when I began to sort of own this idea of like, I'm the quote unquote gringo, right? And it's like this silly thing that people make fun of or get mad at me because I'm calling myself a gringo, but whatever. Again, anybody who's new here, that was something my family called me, or specifically it's a story of a girl in Puerto Rico that I was hitting on that called me a gringo. But anyway, moving on. That's a part of the first episode ever if you want to listen to it. I'm not going to rehash that entire story. But the main point I'm trying to make here is what I realized in my journey is that nobody could take my experience away from me, right? And at the end of the day, my intention and my confidence in myself has forced others to embrace me, right? And that's, I think, what was always missing, right? Where they were able to make me feel like an outsider because I also allowed them to, right? I didn't correct them, or I allowed them to shame me and I shamed myself, right? Rather than saying, no, like, this is my experience and it doesn't make me any less authentic than you, or any less a member of this community, right? And again, what I realized was when I took away their power to put me as the outsider, right? To put me in the corner somewhere, when they no longer had that power, it was like they just kind of fell in line and said, okay, this is Dramos, and he's a part of our community and talks about how he doesn't speak proper Spanish and, didn't grow up necessarily inundated in the culture and had to go lose himself to find himself again. And it's kind of like, hey, that's his story, right? Because I really am a firm believer of oftentimes the outside world just mirrors what we feel about ourselves internally, right? So my lack of confidence in my authenticity, and specifically in this conversation around my culture, my community, and where I belong, but I think in general, that is what allowed others and actually invited others to sort of join in on the sort of lack of self-worth that was going on, right? So my lack of internal self-worth, or my lack of confidence internally, sort of, it was an invitation to them subconsciously to sort of pile it on, right? Again, you're going to meet the assholes. You're going to meet the people who are elitist and whatever it is what it is, right? But I firmly believe when it's like, when I think about, I'm getting ready to go speak on a panel about Latin music in a couple weeks, right? And I'm going to speak about, for Latin Heritage Month, I'm going to go be one of the representatives for my Cultura on stage somewhere in New York, right? Like, that's so wild to me, right? That's fucking crazy. When I think back to me, I don't know what, my late 20s, like, that person never would have imagined standing on a stage amongst other Latinos and all of their credentials within the community, and not only feeling comfortable, but also confident in the fact that he knew his voice was needed, right? That his voice represented a sector of the community that none of those other people were speaking to. And I had given a talk, like another example, kind of where my mind is right now and the internal dialogue that happens to hopefully help anybody else. Like, and again, if you're not Latin or you don't relate to this exactly, you can interchange your Latinness with your authenticity, showing up as your goofy self, as your weird self, whatever it is, right? But for me, I had given a talk at a conference, or like a whatever it was, a meetup. It's like they talk about it as, it's like the idea is that it is TED Talks for the Latin community, right? So I was one of, I don't know, like 7 or 8 speakers, and I got there, before the event started, and we're kind of just going through the run of show, and everybody is all dressed up. They're all a bit older than me. They're all speaking to each other in Spanish. Everybody seems to know each other. I immediately get put back into that place of being a younger dude, insecure, and feeling like an outsider here, and like I don't fit in. And my immediate inclination is, okay, I think I should adjust my speech a little bit to suit this crowd, right? Because they're not going to relate to me at all, right? They're all dressed up. I'm in like a Yankee hat and dressed very casual. I'm gonna go talk about how I never felt accepted by my community, to people who, many of them, very obviously feel a part of their community, and Spanish was their first language, right? And I immediately went into that people-pleasing version of myself, the insecure version of myself who always felt like an outsider amongst his people. And then the second dialogue comes along in my head, right? The healed part of me begins to check that like wounded inner child and reminds him that you're here invited and getting to live out the life that you do because your voice is needed, right? Because you are filling a void, because you are speaking to a sector of this community who has felt ignored for so long by people just like those who are going to be speaking before you. And not that they're doing it intentionally or with malice, but they're speaking from their vantage point, right? So I had to remind myself that not only is my otherness what got me here invited to speak in front of a crowd of people at a college in New York City, it's also what's going to allow me to stand out from this entire group of people that includes many seasoned public speakers. That my authenticity is what's going to set me apart, and it's what's gotten me here right now. And that made me snap back into place. And it was like, a parent talking to their kid, like, nope, this is what we came here to do. We're doing it this way. You're not changing. You're not leaving. You're not doing anything differently. We're going to do what we came here to do, right? For me, it was like, we're going to live or die by what we came here to do, by our authenticity. It's going to resonate or it's not, but I'm not going to change who I am, what I represent, or my voice just to try to fit into some crowd, right? My people are out there. I know that. And maybe they aren't in this room, but either way, I'm always going to be a representative for them because that's the most authentic way I can show up. And it's the way that I can be of service to my community in the biggest way. So I gave that speech. I got a standing ovation. And at the end of it, the compliments and the critique that I got from people was, you were the most authentic person up there. I related most to your talk because you spoke like me. You were honest. You were vulnerable. All of these different things. Right? Even people who couldn't relate to my story, you had people speaking to me in Spanish, but talked about how much it resonated with them just because of the authenticity behind it. So again, the irony of this situation, kind of bringing it all full circle, is I kept feeling like I had to change who I was in order for my community to embrace me. When now in my adulthood, in my 30s, after having done a tremendous amount of work and getting more comfortable with who I am, the irony is that me owning who I am actually is the key to me getting embraced by the very same people whose acceptance I've been searching for so long. And the irony is that, again, most of them, or some of them, I should say, in this particular instance, couldn't relate to my story, but welcomed me with open arms because they recognized that I was speaking authentically and that I was speaking truth and that I was a part of their community, right? I just happened to have a different perspective. And the fact that I spoke about it confidently, walked on stage, and told my truth made them either open their minds to something that they weren't sure about before, or happy to see that a different voice that they knew was out there was finally being represented, right? Because I know I had somebody who was talking about, this is how you're going to connect to the youth, right? Those same kids who grew up like you and are growing up now, you're going to inspire them to embrace their culture and to keep their culture alive. And again, all of this is through me being unapologetic and showing up speaking from my unique vantage point. And with it, proving that I had a place in this community and feeling truly embraced by it. And that's kind of the thing I want to push forward, kind of bring it back even to how I started this part of the segment about, the member of the Just Be Social Club who's representing his Hispanic cohort, him being on this journey of trying to connect with his culture. He's probably the best person that there could be to lead that, right? Because he's providing a bridge for so many people who have been wanting that, but maybe are scared to use their voice or scared to be shunned, right? Because those who are what we would look at and say, oh man, they're just like, they're so Latin, it hurts, right? They speak Spanish and they talk a certain way, dress a certain way, whatever it might be, right? They already feel like they're a part of it, right? And they have their place as well, of course. But they're going to attract the same people over and over again, right? Those who already feel a part of this. Your sort of journey that you're on is potentially going to bring in a whole nother group of people who might have been interested but never dared to explore it because they never felt like they had their place there. They never felt like they saw themselves in it, right? And that's why it's so important for all of us to be able to speak from our unique, authentic vantage point, right? Wherever we fall in the things that I'm describing and the traits that I'm describing, all of us have some sort of unique experience. We're all connected, which is beautiful, but we all also have a unique vantage point that allows us to see the world in a certain way. And that's crucial because it allows us to speak to different people. Our community is so diverse, right? And beautiful and different. We can't have the same voices over and over again being the only representation that we see, right? We're doing ourselves a disservice as a community. And that's why your authenticity is needed in this world. Again, even if it has nothing to do with your race or your ethnicity, whatever it might be, but that applies to anything. You being a Black comic book nerd speaks to a very specific sector of this world that I'm sure used to get made fun of by their own community at some point. And now you make it okay to be a Black comic book nerd. You get what I'm saying? Like all of this is important. Us all speaking our truth because we are providing the cosign for others to then live in their truth, which is one of the key elements to being truly happy and fulfilled in this world. And that's why it's so important for us to embrace all the sides of ourselves, regardless of sort of what societal norms have been, because it's bigger than just ourselves. We're doing it for the next person who just needs a little bit of inspiration to be able to truly find themselves and walk in their purpose at the end of the day. Now, with that said, let's tie everything we've been talking about today in a neat little bow in a segment we call Conclusion Stew.
Time for conclusion stew.
All right, so I don't think I have to dive too deep back into all that we were talking about. I think, again, we're just kind of revisiting a conversation that is the basis of this podcast, right? And this journey that I've personally been on and have been blessed to be on. I think the one thing I want to pull from that article that I had referenced on Project, it's not even Project NYE. I'm a dummy. My eyesight is terrible when I pull up on the big screen. Project Enye.com, Enye.com. ENYE. I'll link to it. I'm gonna own that. I'm not even gonna edit this out. But I think the one thing I love that was like a bar, it was the idea of developing feelings of connection through rejection, right? Connection through rejection. I haven't heard it phrased that way. I wish I thought of that. But I think that's what this podcast is. It's like those of us who have felt rejected as outsiders, as otherness, other than, whatever, lesser than, whatever it might be, like we're finding community in our common rejection. We're finding connection in that rejection. And I think that's the beauty of this life, and a reminder of that we're not ever truly alone, right? And I think that's just such a beautiful way to look at it, is the idea of, even in the moments that feel like they are negative, right? A moment of rejection, there is somebody else out there sharing in a similar feeling, and you're never truly alone, right? There's always somebody else out there who can relate to your story. And I think that's the beauty of this conversation as a whole, I think meaning behind this podcast in general, right? For me starting it, wanting to find my tribe, and having found it, and now sort of using it as a vehicle to inspire people. And I just think this journey that I've been on as a result of being authentic and expressing and being vulnerable about my rejections has given me everything I've ever hoped for in the form of feeling connected to others and a community, and then being a part of a community that I wanted to be a part of for so long, right? Being able to feel like I have a place in my Latinness, right? And in the Latin community as a whole, that I have a seat there that is designated for me, right? That only I could fill, right? And it's just as important as any other seat in that community. And I think there's a beauty in that. And I think, if there's one other thing I could sort of reiterate about this larger conversation, it's the idea that everything you've ever wanted is on the other side of your authenticity, right? When I got more vulnerable, when I was authentic about my experience and not feeling like I was embraced and feeling less than, as I've said a million times, that's when it was like the fucking floodgates just opened for me. This podcast became a thing. I started building community. I started harnessing my voice. I started becoming a representative of this community because I could speak from a certain vantage point and represented a certain part of this community, right? And I get to connect with other people now through things like the Just Be Social Club who have felt similarly, right, to myself. It's just a beautiful sort of magical development of life that I could have never predicted, that literally came from me no longer trying to please everybody, but just trying to be true to myself. And when I began to become, true to myself and embrace myself and love myself for who I was, the rest of the world began to treat me that same exact way. And I think we are a mirror to the world outside, right? If we walk in confidence in our authenticity and own everything, the things that we're supposed to quote unquote be ashamed of, we own it as our truths. People can't use that against us. They have no choice but to embrace us as we are. Doesn't mean they have to like us or agree with us, but they can't take anything away from us. We've owned that shame that they would try to hang over our heads. They no longer can, right? And I truly do believe that much of the substantial change that I've seen in my life has come from the self-love that developed from me being unafraid to be authentic and vulnerable about my experiences. And that just created confidence that then compounded, that then forced the other worlds, the outside world, I should say, to treat me with that same level of respect that I was giving myself, right? I was commanding respect and demanding respect both internally, and then as a result, that sort of seeped out externally and others sort of had to fall in line accordingly, right? But again, it all started with me accepting myself and loving myself for my story and recognizing the power within it, that then everybody else sort of fell in line at that point. And that's my sort of greatest piece of advice for anybody that's sort of struggling with their otherness, is that when you begin to own it, you're going to see that others have no choice but to treat you differently or treat you how you treat yourself at the end of the day, right? They can't hang these things over your head when it's no longer something that you're ashamed of. When you own it as your superpower, as a part of your story, they're only giving you a compliment at that point, right? They're only adding to your story if they try and use these things against you, right? It doesn't have that effect on you anymore because you've internally resolved those struggles and recognized the power and beauty in those things, because they make you you. They make you the unique individual that you are, the authentic individual that you are. And the beauty in that is you are never alone, no matter how much it seems like it. There are always going to be other people who can relate to all the trials and tribulations that you've gone through, right? Again, it's connection through that common rejection. And I think there's something so beautiful within that. With that said, thank y'all so much for tuning into today's episode. JustBe.nyc. If you want to join the Just Be Social Club, you can apply. We have 4 spots left. This group offer includes lifelong group mastermind participation, as well as 3 months of one-on-one coaching weekly on the 4 pillars of conscious living. You can apply for it now, justbe.nyc. Head over to the Social Club tab, and you can check all that out. Book a free one-on-one with myself and my business partner, Brenda, and we can walk you through it, see if you're a good fit. And with that said, man, thank y'all so much for tuning in. I'll catch you on Thursday for a brand new episode for our Thursday Trends. Till then, stay safe. Talk soon. Peace.